Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
The Bordens were the most important family in the town of Fall River. They had been there for hundreds of years. Yet the Bordens' house was not so very grand. Old Andrew Borden was too careful with his money for that. A cold, hard, loveless man. In 1892, he was 70 years old, and he would not live to see 71. The home at 92 2nd Street was comfortable enough for Andrew Borden and his family. Comfortable, but not grand. Down in the basement was a coal-fired furnace, which kept the house warm in winter. Near the furnace was a chopping block, with a stack of wood for lighting the fire. And near the chopping block was an axe, for splitting up the wood into sticks. The home contained 4 women: Andrew's daughters, Emma and Lizzie, their stepmother, Abby Borden, and the maidservant, Bridget. In 1892, Mrs. Abby Borden was 63 years old, and she would not live to see 64. Abby never managed to take the place of Emma and Lizzie's mother in the hearts of the 2 young women. Number 92 2nd Street was not a happy home. Lizzie was 32 in 1892. She had inherited her father's meanness, so she was disgusted and furious when her father gave a gift of land to his wife's family. At that moment, something seemed to snap in Lizzie's strange mind. She never forgave, and she never forgot. "Lizzie," Mrs. Abby Borden said one day, "I haven't seen my cat for ages. Do you know where he is?" Lizzie wasn't beautiful, but her large, light eyes were the most attractive thing about her. "Go downstairs," she promised, "and you'll find your cat." And those eyes glowed with pleasure. Mrs. Borden went down to the cellar and found the cat. It had been laid across the chopping block, and someone had used the axe to cut off its head. But that was nothing compared to what would follow. August 4th, 1892 was a hot and humid morning. Even at 6:15, the sun was blazing hot as maidservant Bridget struggled downstairs to light the cooking stove. She felt ill. Everyone in the house had been sick the day before, maybe from eating meat that had gotten too warm in the summer weather. Little Emma was spared because she was away on holiday. After breakfast, Mrs. Borden went upstairs to lie down. She was still feeling unwell from the day before. Mr. Borden left for work, while Bridget set about cleaning the windows. But by 11:20, Mr. Borden had returned. He struggled with the locks on the front door. Someone had pushed the bolt in so hard that Bridget could hardly open it to let her master in. Lizzie stood at the top of the stairs, laughing to herself. "Where's your mother?" Mr. Borden asked as he strode in. "She had a message to go and visit someone who's sick." "Who?" her father asked. "I don't know, Father." "Well, they can't be sicker than me," the old man snapped. "I still feel weak from yesterday. I think I'll lie down in the sitting room." Lizzie smiled. It was now 2 minutes to 11. Bridget went back to washing windows as Lizzie set up an ironing board and started ironing handkerchiefs. "Excuse me, Miss Lizzie, but I feel sick again," the girl groaned. "If you don't mind, I'll just lie down." The maidservant climbed up to her bedroom in the attic. The City Hall clock struck 11 as Bridget lay down on her bed. Only 10 minutes later, she heard Lizzie cry out, "Bridget! Bridget, come downstairs!" Bridget struggled from her bed. "What's wrong, Miss Lizzie?"
"Come down quickly,"
Lizzie shouted.
"Father's dead. Somebody's come inside and killed him."
Bridget went to the sitting room to look, but Lizzie stopped her.
No! Don't go in there! Go and get a doctor! Run!
But Bridget couldn't find the local doctor. She left a message with the doctor's wife and hurried back to number 92 2nd Street.
How could this happen? The girl groaned. Where were you, Miss Lizzie?
In the garden, Lizzie Borden sighed. When I came back, the door was open wide. A neighbor, Mrs. Churchill, saw the frantic women and came over to find out what was wrong. She opened the door to the sitting room where Andrew Borden had gone to rest. His feet were on the floor, his head resting on the arm, but it was a head that no one would have recognized. There were 11 cuts between his nose and ear. One blow had sliced his eye in half, and another had almost cut his nose clean off. Blood covered the walls, the floor, and the sofa, but Andrew Borden hadn't moved. His killer had slaughtered him as he slept. Mrs. Churchill backed out of the room.
Where were you when this happened?
She gasped. I was in the barn, Lizzie murmured.
Your poor mother. Where is she?
Lizzie shrugged, helpless. She went to visit a sick friend. I don't know who. Mrs. Churchill took charge. She sent messages for the doctor and the police. By 11:30, she returned to the house of death on 2nd Street.
If only we could find your mother, Lizzie, she said. Maybe we should send a message to her friend, Mrs. Whitehead.
No, Lizzie answered sharply.
I'm sure I just heard her come in the front and go up to her room. Bridget, go and see.
But Bridget wouldn't go alone.
I'll go with you,
Mrs. Churchill offered. The two set up the front stairs. They didn't need to climb quite to the top. The bedroom door was open. Bridget stopped. Behind the bed, half hidden, lay Abby Borden's body. Mrs. Churchill pushed past the rigid maidservant and looked at the gruesome sight. 19 blows had rained down on the back of her head, and one had chopped deep into her neck. But the blood had started to dry and turn dark. In that hothouse, which was home to such cold people, Lizzie Borden stayed cooler than ice. As her parents' corpses lay in their blood-stained rooms, she said calmly, I think I'd prefer them to be buried by Undertaker Winwood. The public believed in Lizzie's innocence at first. After all, she was a Borden, a lady from the finest family in Fall River. She ran a $5,000 ad in the paper for the arrest and conviction of the person responsible, which would be around $200,000 today. The public was forced to live in terror that a madman with an axe was on the loose. That same Friday, the Fall River police found a new, amazing fact. The day before the murders, Lizzie Borden had been to a local chemist's shop where she tried to buy some deadly poison. On Saturday, the funeral was held for Abby and Andrew Borden. On Sunday, Lizzie was found trying to burn an old dress. Why are you doing that? A friend asked. It's covered in paint, Lizzie said. But it looks so suspicious burning old clothes. The police will say you're trying to hide blood stains. Ah, Lizzie gasped. I didn't think of that. I only wish you'd stopped me sooner. But mean Lizzie Borden had burned a dress that was only 10 weeks old. Something unheard of in the penny-pinching Borden house. And 1 week later, the Fall River police arrested Lizzie Borden for the murders. Lizzie's theory was that her father had not been a popular man, and surely there were plenty of men and women who wanted to see him dead. She suggested that the killer had slipped poison into the Borden's milk that Wednesday morning, but it was only enough to make them sick, not take their lives. So the following morning, the killer returned to finish the job. Mrs. Borden received a note requesting that she visit a sick friend and left for the day while Lizzie went out to the barn. Meanwhile, an ill Mr. Borden came home early and laid down to take a nap. Bridget, the maid, was sick as well, and at some point rushed out of the house through the back door to vomit, leaving the door open for a few moments. That was when the killer snuck inside, and with one of the axes from the Borden cellar, hacked Andrew Borden to death. When Lizzie suddenly returned from the barn, the killer was forced to hide. This is when Lizzie discovered the body of her father and asked Mrs. Churchill to fetch the police. Now, Mrs. Borden returned from visiting her friend, and the killer followed her upstairs to take her life with the same axe. This person then escaped through the front door while police entered through the back. The trouble is, experts were certain that Mrs. Borden had died before Mr. Borden, which explains why the blood was already dry. There was no indication that Mrs. Borden had ever left the house that day, and likewise, no sign whatsoever that Lizzie had gone into the barn. The policeman that entered the barn first swore that the floor was thick with dust, and there was not a single scuff or footprint in sight. The trial was almost a year later, and in the middle of another heat wave. Inside the courtroom, which was over 100 degrees, the lawyer had placed 2 items on the table, covered in tissue paper. He removed the first, one of Lizzie's dresses, and the tissue fell away from the second box. It contained the shattered skulls of Mr. and Mrs. Borden. Lizzie fell into a dead faint at the shock, but the shock was not great enough to make her confess. She sat silent through the days of the trial. At last, her lawyer pleaded that the jury must either set poor Lizzie free or be blamed for placing a noose around her neck. He reminded them that Andrew had gone to his grave wearing a ring that was gifted from Lizzie. "To find her guilty," he finished, "you must find her a fiend. Does she look it?" The 12 men of the jury looked at Andrew Borden's little girl. Her large, pale eyes looked back, eyes that had never shed a tear for their deaths. Yet, as her lawyer claimed, the eyes that cannot weep are the saddest eyes of all. The judge turned to her and asked, "Lizzie Borden, have you any words you wish to say to this jury?" She rose slowly to her feet, bowed before the judge, and looked straight at the 12 men. "I am innocent. I leave it to my counsel to speak for me." 13 words. The only words that Lizzie Borden spoke at her own trial. The jury voted. The clerk of the court asked, "Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached your verdict?" "We have." "What do you say?" "Not guilty." A huge cheer swept the courtroom. Lizzie sat back in her seat and at last managed a tear, in sheer relief that her neck had been saved. So what if the killer was a member of the household, but it wasn't Lizzie? One scholar suggests that Bridget, the maid, had had enough of the Bordens, mean and thoughtless people who demanded the hardest labor even on the hottest days of the year. So she tried to poison them, including taking some herself, but it didn't work. So the following day, in the midst of her chores, she took an axe from the cellar and crept up to Mrs. Borden's room. The woman was kneeling on the floor over a large piece of embroidery. It was too easy. So she smashed the axe down over and over into Mrs. Borden's head until she was exhausted. Then she cleaned herself up and went out to the barn to fetch some water. At this time, Mr. Borden returned home and went to rest, and Bridget suggested that she would lay down too. When Lizzie went out to the barn, Bridget killed Andrew. There were fewer blows, and they were weaker ones, because Bridget was now too tired to do more. When Lizzie discovered the body, Bridget suggested that she could be blamed, and they agreed on the story that Mrs. Borden had left the house. And of course, Bridget refused to go up to Mrs. Borden's bedroom alone, because she knew what she would find there. But some say that Lizzie got away with murder. And the truth was, many people knew that she hated her father and stepmother. So she waited until her sister had gone on holiday. Then, on that fateful Tuesday, she tried to buy poison to get rid of them. When the chemist wouldn't sell her poison, she was able to find another option elsewhere. It just happened to be less potent. She slipped it into their food on Wednesday, even giving herself a little so no one would suspect. But it wasn't enough to kill them. The next morning, she waited for her father to leave before creeping upstairs and hacking her mother to death with the axe. She then had well over an hour to clean herself up before her father returned. When Andrew came home and lay down to sleep, she killed him too. Once again, she had ample time to clean herself and hide the murder weapon before she called out to Bridget, pretending she'd just discovered her father's body. When Bridget asked where Mrs. Borden was, Lizzie panicked and came up with the story about the sick friend. When Mrs. Churchill insisted upon searching the house for Mrs. Borden, Lizzie suddenly remembered that she'd heard the woman return to the house. Later, when she realized she missed a spot of blood on her dress, she was forced to burn it. Lizzie gambled that a jury would not want to see a young woman hang, and she won her gamble. After being declared innocent, Lizzie went back to the house of death and lived with the ghosts of her butchered father and stepmother. She died a millionaire 34 years after the trial in 1927.
Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41.
A full moon is in the sky. The clock strikes 12. These are tales for the midnight hour. Susan was my best friend, but I try never to think about her. It's only on certain nights, when I'm all alone in my room, that I remember. It was during Christmas vacation last year when Susan asked me to stay at her house overnight. She lived in a big, gloomy house set way back from the road, and she didn't want to be alone there at night. Her parents had gone to visit some friends and wouldn't be back until the next afternoon. Susan said we could have a really good time without her parents around. And we did. At about midnight, we decided to get dressed for bed. Susan was given this velvet nightrobe for Christmas that had a thick furry collar. It was blood red velvet, and she looked like someone from a Dracula movie in it. We had been watching television in the living room, but then we turned it off. We hadn't noticed it before, but now the downstairs seemed too big, almost sinister. We started to go upstairs. Then, all of a sudden, we both ran up the steps to Susan's room as if something was coming up from behind us. After we closed the door, we laughed at ourselves, but neither one of us wanted to leave the room again. We sat down and started to talk, and that's when we first heard the noise. It sounded like somebody sharpening a knife on an old emery stone. We stopped talking and looked at each other, feeling really scared inside. There was just a thick silence in the room. Suddenly, Susan started to laugh. She said she had heard a sound like that in the house before. She said it was probably the shutters or something. That made me feel better, and we went back to talking. But then we heard it again. The sound made my teeth vibrate as if somebody's fingernails were scratching on a chalkboard. But this sound was much worse. It shrieked up from the dark, lonely rooms below us. Susan got a wild look in her eyes, as if something horrible had come into her head. Before I could catch her, she ran out of the room, slamming the door shut and flicking off the light switch. I heard her footsteps as she ran down the first flight of stairs, and then stopped. I sat in the dark, sick with fright. I called out Susan's name, but my voice was answered by hushed silence. I didn't want to stay in the dark room alone, but even more, I didn't want to go out into that other darkness. Then I heard it again, that disgusting sound. Then I heard Susan's footsteps, moving down the next and final flight of stairs. She went more slowly, as if she really didn't want to. I heard her reach the bottom. I waited in the room, wondering what Susan was doing. I told myself she must be all right. The noise had stopped right after I heard her reach the bottom of the stairs. She had probably just fixed the shutter. Maybe she had just acted strangely to scare me. Maybe she was sitting on the steps now, laughing at me. I got up and started toward the door to turn the light on, but a feeling of fear swept over me that held me back like a hand against my throat. I decided I would wait where I was for Susan to return. I would wait there until her parents returned, if necessary. Nothing could make me leave my darkness for that darker unknown outside the room. Time passed. My ears strained for a sound and my nerves tingled at imagined shadows. Then I heard a slow, shuffling noise on the bottom step. Was it Susan? It had to be. Yet the footsteps seemed too heavy, too deliberate. My heart began to pound, and for a moment I lost control of my mind. It flew to the most horrible corners of my imagination, and I shook with terror. Then suddenly I knew what I would do. Susan's new nightrobe with the furry collar. I would wait for the door to open, and then I would reach out and touch the person's neck. If I felt the furry collar, I would know it was Susan, and I would get her back for scaring me like this. And if I didn't feel the furry collar, then there was nothing I could do. The shuffling footsteps had reached the second flight of stairs. I forced my own feet to take the steps to get near the door of the room. I felt the skin crawling on my back as the footsteps reached the top stair and moved down the hallway. I braced myself. The door creaked slightly as it swung open. I reached out my arms and hoped. My fingers closed around the thick fur of Susan's collar, and my body drained with relief. I moved my hands up to touch Susan's face. I was so happy I no longer even cared to scare her. But as my fingers moved up from the furry collar, there was nothing there. Only the bloody stump where Susan's head used to be. There was one room in the house that the old man always kept locked. Things had not changed in that room for years. A soft layer of dust had settled on the furniture and on the thing that lay on the floor beside the bed. The old man had been a bachelor most of his life. When he was 40 years old, he had met her, the girl with the black velvet ribbon. She was beautiful in a strange, mysterious way. Her hair and her deep, bottomless eyes were as black as the velvet ribbon around her neck. He planned to marry her before the next full moon rose in the autumn sky. On their wedding day, he watched her walk toward him up the long aisle. She was dressed in a white gown with a white veil and carried a bouquet of white flowers. Even her face was ivory white, but below it, around the ivory neck, was the black velvet ribbon. He remembered staring at that ribbon as the strains of the wedding march brought his bride nearer to him. He remembered the curious and shocked looks on the faces of the wedding guests. But then his eyes met hers, and he was drowning in their bottomless darkness. He didn't think of the velvet ribbon during the rest of his wedding day. It was a joyous time, and if people thought his wife was a bit strange, they kept it to themselves. That night, when they were alone, he saw that the ribbon was still there, still circling her lovely neck. "Don't you ever take that ribbon from around your neck?" he asked, hoping his question was a needless one. "You'll be sorry if I do," his wife answered, "so I won't." Her answer disturbed him, but he did not question her further. There was plenty of time for her to change her ways. Their life together fell into a pleasant pattern. They were happy, as most newly married couples are. He found her to be a perfect wife, Well, nearly perfect. Although she had a great number of dresses and wore a different one every day, she never changed the black velvet ribbon. This ribbon began to be the test of their marriage. When he looked at her, his eyes would inevitably fall to her neck. When he kissed her, he could feel the ribbon tightening around his own throat. "Won't you please take that ribbon from around your neck?" he asked her time and time again. "You'll be sorry if I do, so I won't." This was always her answer. At first it teased him. Then it began to grate on his nerves. Now it was beginning to infuriate him. "You'll be sorry if I do. You'll be sorry if I do." One day, he tried to pull the ribbon off after she had repeated her answer, like a mechanical doll. It wouldn't come loose from around her neck. He realized then, for the first time, that the ribbon had no beginning and no end. It circled her neck like a band of steel. He had drawn back from her in disgust that day, and things weren't the same with them after that. At the breakfast table, the black ribbon seemed to mock him as he drank his suddenly bitter coffee. In the afternoon, outside, the ribbon made a funeral out of the sunlight. But it was at night that the ribbon bothered him most. He knew he could live with it no longer. "Either you take that ribbon off, or I will," he said to his wife of 4 weeks. "You'll be sorry if I do, so I won't." She smiled at him, and then fell off to sleep. But he did not sleep. He lay there, staring at that hated ribbon. He had meant what he said. If she would not take off that ribbon, he would. As she lay sleeping and unsuspecting, he crept out of bed and to her sewing box. He had seen a small, sharp scissors she kept there. It was thin enough, he knew, to slip between the velvet ribbon and her soft neck. Gripping the scissors in his trembling hands, he walked softly back to the bed. He came up to where she lay and stood over her. Her head was thrown back on the pillow, and her throat, with the black velvet ribbon around it, rose ever so slightly with her breathing. He bent down, and with one swift movement, he forced the thin blade of the scissors under the ribbon. Then, with a quick, triumphant snip, he severed the ribbon that had come between them. The black velvet ribbon fell away from his wife's neck, and her head rolled off the bed onto the floor. She was muttering, "You'll be sorry. You'll be sorry. You'll be sorry." The boy lay quietly in the dark. He was listening. Next door, the boarder was making the sounds of preparing for bed. The boy could hear him brush his teeth, gargle, and then splash water onto his face. The sounds made the boy grit his teeth. He hated the boarder. The two of them shared the upstairs floor of a small house in the poor area of town. The boy's parents had taken the boarder in to add his rent to their meager income. Until then, the boy had always had the upstairs to himself. The extra bedroom had been his playroom. Now, the boy was kept to his own small space. In the next room, the boarder was getting his bed ready for the night. The boy heard him plump the pillows. Then he heard the creak of the old bed springs as the boarder lay down. The boy wondered if the boarder knew how well he could be heard, how much the boy knew about every move he made. The sound of the light switch being flicked off came through the thin walls. Now the boy knew the boarder was lying in the dark too, listening for him. It was a waiting game. The boy knew the boarder would be going out tonight. For the last month, he had known about the Friday night journeys. This night, the boy planned to follow the boarder to wherever it was that he went. The boy lay perfectly still in his bed. He had learned how to be very quiet. It bothered him to think that the boarder could hear him as well as he could hear the boarder. So he had begun to walk softly and creep slowly into bed, and to do everything quietly, like a cat. The boarder didn't know how much the boy could hear from his room. But no sound came from the boarder's room now, except the muffled sounds of snoring. The boy hated that snoring, just as he hated everything about the boarder. He hated his snickering laugh and the way the boarder looked at his mother at the breakfast table. He despised his chores of shining the boarder's shoes and going on errands for him. Most of all, he hated the boarder's money, which his parents needed so badly. The money was the reason the boy lay awake in bed. No one knew how the boarder got his money. No one knew how he spent his days away from the house. No one asked questions because the rent money was always there, fully paid, in advance. The boy lay in the dark and struggled to keep his eyes open. Tonight, he was going to follow the boarder and find out his secret. The seconds of time ticked by in the boy's mind as he lay waiting. He knew the boarder would pretend to sleep like this at first, but the time was drawing near now for him to make his move. The boy waited in silent darkness. Then, from the next room, came the slow creaking of springs. The boy raised his head to hear better. The springs creaked again as the boarder's weight crushed against them. Then, they were quiet. Now the boy knew that the boarder was preparing for his journey. He would be slipping into his clothes in the dark, pulling on his rubber-soled shoes. The boy slipped out of bed and reached for his own clothes. He didn't make a sound as he dressed himself and put on his sneakers. He tiptoed over to the window in his room and pressed himself against the wall. He was ready. The window in the boarder's room slid open with a slight scratching noise of wood against wood. The boy stared sideways out his window. He watched as two legs quietly and carefully made their way across the small balcony outside the window. Then they disappeared. For a few seconds, the boy heard no sound. Then there was a dull thud on the ceiling above him. The boarder had gotten up onto the roof. Moving quietly, just like the boarder, the boy slid open his window. He swung his body over the sill and onto the small balcony. He knew he was taking a chance of the boarder seeing him, but he knew if he waited too long, the boarder might be out of sight. The boy climbed down the drainage pipe up to the roof as the boarder had done before him. He slowly raised his eyes to the level of the roof. Standing 20 feet away and staring across the rooftops was the boarder. The boy could see the eager expression on his face. He could also see the shiny hook hanging from his belt and the coil of thick rope hung over his shoulder. The boy lowered his head as the boarder moved across the rooftop, jumping from their house to the next one. The roofs were only 4 feet apart because the houses were built so close together in this neighborhood. The boy saw the boarder walk across that roof and jump on to the next house. It was a dark night, and the moon was hidden by clouds. The boy hoisted himself onto the roof and crept over to the chimney. 3 houses away, he could see the boarder walking steadily east. He knew he had to follow the boarder fast enough to keep up with him, but slowly enough not to be seen. The boy came to the space between his house and the next one. The cement walkway between the 2 houses stared up at him from 40 feet below. He felt sick for a moment. Then he leapt across to the next roof. As he landed, he saw the boarder turn around from 3 houses away. The boy flattened himself against the tar roof. He watched as the boarder paused, searching the darkness for the source of the sound he had heard. But the boarder couldn't see the boy's body pressed up against the roof, and he went on, jumping to the next roof to the east. The boy managed to the next jump more quietly, and the boarder didn't turn around. It became like a game of leapfrog between them. The boarder jumping, then the boy jumping 3 houses behind him. The boy learned not to look down at the black, gaping spaces between the roofs. His face, too, took on an expression of eager excitement. Ahead, the boy could see that they were coming to the end of the block of small houses. As the boarder came to the last house, he turned left and began to cross the roofs going north. The boy knew that these roofs were no longer set apart. They were the roofs of the stores on Main Street, which were built right beside one another. The boy ran softly to a chimney and, crouching behind it, resting. The boarder, too, had stopped. He seemed to be counting the roofs of the connected buildings with his outstretched hand. Then he moved on down the roofs, walking confidently now. The boy followed slowly, bent down low. The roofs were flatter here than they had been on the houses. He followed behind the line of chimneys that stretched out in a row across the roofs. Suddenly, deliberately, the boarder stopped in front of one of the chimneys. The boy jerked his body to a halt and darted behind the closest chimney. When he peeked around it, he saw the boarder shrugging the heavy coil of rope off his shoulder. He picked up the end of the rope and began to wind the coil around the chimney. The boy watched as he worked to make a strong knot in the rope. Then, the boarder picked up the rest of the coil of rope and dropped it down the chimney. After a few seconds, a dull thud came from inside of the bricks. The boy sat behind the chimney, watching intently. His mind was in a fever. Now he knew the boarder's secret. The metal hook from the boarder's belt flashed in the dull moonlight. The boy watched the boarder fasten the hook onto the chimney ledge. Then, as the moon shone brightly from an opening in the cloudy sky, the boy could see the boarder slowly descending into the chimney. As the boarder's head disappeared, the boy moved quickly across the roofs. He came to the chimney tied round with the boarder's rope, and sat down and listened. The boarder's grunts came up the chimney as he lowered himself down the rope. The boy knew what the boarder planned to do. He was looking for an old open fireplace. He could enter a store, rob it, and return up the chimney by rope. There would be no chance of a fire burning on such a hot summer night. The boarder's grunts disgusted the boy. Now that he knew the boarder's secret, he hated him even more. He eyed the rope twisted around the chimney. The knot was directly in front of him. The boy touched the knot. It wasn't a very good one. He began to undo the loose end, thinking how stupid the boarder was. He began to pick at the knot more, thinking of how the boarder looked at his mother. He began to tug the loose end of the rope through the final tie, thinking of how the boarder's room used to be his own. The knot came undone and the rope started to slip around the chimney. Then, suddenly, it disappeared down through the top. Seconds later, the boy heard a startled cry, followed by a dull thud. The boy crouched near the roof. He knew the boarder had fallen. It sounded as though he had landed on the sealed bottom of the chimney. The boy wondered if the boarder was dead. But then he heard the boarder's voice, grunting with effort. He listened to the voice for a long time as the boarder desperately tried to climb back up the chimney. He listened until the boarder's voice took on the mad sounds of panic, and then he ran away. He ran across the store roofs, across the house roofs, jumping from one to the other. He reached the roof of his own house and swung himself down the pipe onto the small balcony. Quietly, he slipped through the window and shut it. In the still darkness, he dropped his clothes on the floor and stole into bed. It was 6 years later. 3 more boarders had come and gone. The boy was 18 now, and he rented the extra upstairs room himself. His parents never asked him where he got the money, and he joked that he did night work. One morning, he went down to breakfast as usual. His mother had his food and newspaper waiting for him on the table. She gave him all the attention now that she used to give the boarders. As he sipped his coffee, he picked up the morning paper. He leafed through it, reading the headlines. Then, a small article caught his eye. The boy read it slowly, and the whole time, his fingers worked unconsciously, going through the motions of untying a knot. Body found in chimney. Yesterday, workers discovered the remains of a body in an old sealed-off chimney. A coroner on the scene said that the person had been dead for at least 5 years. Authorities suspect that a cat burglar, trying to rob a jewelry store in the building, had become stuck in the chimney. Because of the advanced deterioration of the body, no identification could be made. The only possessions found with the body were a steel hook and an old rope. In the bosom of a spacious cove on the eastern shore of the Hudson, there lies a small market port, which is generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, murmuring just enough to lull one to rest, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker, the only sounds that ever break the uniform tranquility. This sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all of the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was cursed by a witch doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others swore that it was long used as a gathering place for indigenous tribes, and a prophet bewitched the soil when it was stolen from them by the settlers. To this day, the place still continues under the sway of dark powers that hold the minds of good people in trance or visions, and they frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. Meteors glare and stars shoot more often across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. The most often seen spirit that haunts this enchanted region is the apparition of a man on horseback without a head. Some say he's the ghost of a fallen soldier whose head had been carried away by a cannonball during battle, now hurrying along in the gloom of night as if on the wings of the wind. It is alleged that his body was buried in the local churchyard, and his ghost rides forth to the scene of the battle each night on a quest for his missing head, passing along the hollow like a midnight blast, in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Within the small town there lived a man by the name of Ichabod Crane, who had moved to Sleepy Hollow to instruct the local children. He was tall and lank, with narrow shoulders and long arms and legs. His hands dangled a mile from his sleeves, and his feet could have served as shovels. To see him striding along the hill on a windy day, his frame so loosely hung together with his clothes fluttering about, one might have mistaken him for some scarecrow escaped from the cornfield. The schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old school books. The low murmur of children's voices could be heard on a drowsy summer's day like the hum of a beehive, only interrupted by the authoritative voice of their instructor. The revenue from the school was small and insufficient to furnish Ichabod, for he had a large appetite and the feeding powers of an anaconda. Thus, all of his belongings were tied up into a cotton handkerchief, and he lived for 1 week at a time at the houses of the children he taught. It was often his delight, after school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself with a good book on the rich bed of clover by the stream near the schoolhouse, until the gathering dusk made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he made his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered that week, every sound of nature, at that witching hour, fluttered his excited imagination. Ichabod was known to pass long winter evenings with the local wives by the fire, listening to spluttering apples roasting on the hearth and their tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields and houses, cursed bridges and brooks, and particularly the Headless Horseman. But of course, no spectre dared show his face in the glow of a crackling fire.
and there was a pleasure in all of this, snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber. But in the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night, the subsequent walk homewards was filled with fearful shapes and shadows across his path. Ichabod found himself frightened by a shrub covered in snow, like a sheeted spectre, and he shrank in curdling terror at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet. With a shivering voice, he recited a psalm in a low, sing-song tone. Dread prevented him from looking back over his shoulder, and he was thrown into hysterics at any rushing blast of wind howling among the trees, in the idea that it could be the Headless Horseman trampling close behind. But these were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness, and Ichabod would have passed a pleasant life of it if his path had not been crossed by Katrina Van Tassel. Katrina was a blooming lass of nearly 20, universally famed for her beauty and expectations. She expertly mixed ancient and modern fashions and wore ornaments of pure yellow gold which had been passed down from her great-great-grandmother. It was no surprise that Ichabod had found favor in his eyes for her after visiting her mansion. Katrina's father was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer, and his property was situated in a green, sheltered, fertile nook along the banks of the Hudson. Ichabod's great green eyes rolled over the fat meadow lands, rich with wheat, rye, buckwheat, and corn, with orchards bursting with red fruit, and his heart yearned after the woman who would inherit these domains, and his peace of mind was at an end. Ichabod's only goal was to gain the affections of Katrina, though he was one of many admirers. Among them, the most formidable was a burly man with thick, curly black hair by the name of Brom van Brunt, broad-shouldered and double-jointed with an air of arrogance. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, foremost at all races and cockfights, and the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side and giving his decisions with a tone that allowed for no appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but for all his overbearing roughness, there was a dash of good humor at the bottom, and he was known far and wide by the name of Brom Bones. With Brom's toyings like the gentle caresses of a bear, Ichabod therefore made his advances in a quiet and gentle manner, and serving as an instructor of music, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. From the moment Ichabod made his advances, a deadly feud arose between him and Brom Bones, who enlisted his gang of rough riders to smoke out the schoolhouse by stopping up the chimney and turning everything inside topsy-turvy so that Ichabod would think the building was used by witches at night. On one fine autumn afternoon, a man came clattering up to the school door with an invitation for Ichabod to attend a party at the Van Tassel mansion. He turned the school loose an hour before the usual time, and spent at least an hour brushing and washing and furbishing up his only suit of rusty black, fixing his messy hair in the reflection of a broken schoolhouse window. He borrowed a horse from a friendly farmer and issued forth like a knight on a quest for adventure. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while the more tender trees had been nipped by frost into brilliant shades of orange, purple, and scarlet. As Ichabod rode slowly on his way, his eye ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn, and soft anticipations stole over his mind of buttered pastries garnished with honey by the delicate and dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the mansion. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having arrived on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of metal and mischief, and which no one else could manage. The farmer greeted his guests with good humor, his face round and jolly as the harvest moon. When the sound of music from the ballroom summoned them all to dance, Ichabod was overjoyed to find Katrina as his partner, and he smiled graciously in reply to the many ogling eyes, while Brom Bones sat brooding by himself in the corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod wandered to the far side of the piazza, where a group sat smoking and gossiping over former times and sharing stories of ghosts and apparitions. Tales were told of funeral trains, and weeping cries and wailings heard near the great haunted tree where many had died. There was mention of the woman in white, who was said to have perished long ago in the snow, and can now be heard shrieking in the winds of winter storms. Before long, the subject was the Headless Horseman, who had been seen or heard many times of late before returning to his resting place in the churchyard. The church itself stands on a knoll, surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms. Over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was an old wooden bridge. The road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it even in the daytime. It was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and where he was most frequently encountered. Brom Bones made light of the spirit, affirming that one night upon returning from a neighboring village, he'd been overtaken by the midnight trooper. He'd offered to race the horseman, and he should have won it too, but just as they came to the old wooden bridge, the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton and vanished in a flash of fire. The party gradually broke up, and families gathered together in their wagons, heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads and over the distant hills. Ichabod lingered behind in hopes of a private moment with Katrina, fully convinced that he was on the road to success. But something must have gone wrong, for quite suddenly he left the mansion and went straight for the stable, rousing his borrowed steed uncourteously from his sleep and pursuing his travels homewards. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, rode along the lofty hills above Tarrytown, where he had traveled so cheerily in the afternoon. In the dead hush of midnight, all the stories of ghosts and goblins came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky and clouds. He was approaching the very place of many of the stories, where an enormous tulip tree towered above all the others like a kind of landmark. As Ichabod approached this fearful spot, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. It was but a blast of wind sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but, on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the white wood laid bare, having been scathed by lightning. Suddenly he heard a horrible groan. His teeth chattered, and his knees gripped against the saddle. But it was only the rubbing of one huge branch upon another as they swayed about by the breeze. A small brook crossed the road near the tree, running into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known as Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He gave his horse a kick in the ribs and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge, but instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal plunged to the opposite side of the road, into a thicket of brambles and bushes. The beast dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a halt just by the brook, with a suddenness that nearly sent Ichabod flying over his head. Just at this moment, in the dark shadow of the grove, on the edge of the brook, there lingered something huge, misshapen and towering, like a gigantic monster awaiting him. Ichabod knew to turn and fly now was too late, and besides, how could he escape a ghost that could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning his courage, Ichabod demanded, "Who are you?" but received no reply. He repeated his demand in a more agitated voice. Still, there was no answer. Once more he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible horse, involuntarily breaking into the psalm he'd sang before, when the shadowy object put itself into motion, bounding to the middle of the road. Now the form could be seen in some degree. He was a massive horseman, mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. Ichabod's horse had seemingly gotten over his fright, and he quickened the steed in hopes of leaving the spirit behind. The horseman, however, matched their pace. So Ichabod pulled back and fell into a walk, hoping to lag behind, but the horseman did the same. His heart began to sink. There was something so mysterious and appalling about the silence of his newfound companion, which was soon accounted for. Upon mounting the rising ground, his fellow traveler found relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in cloak, and Ichabod was horror-struck to see that he was headless. His head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on his saddle. Ichabod's terror rose to desperation, and he rained a shower of kicks and blows upon the horse, hoping to somehow give his companion the slip. But the headless horseman stuck with him. They dashed through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lanky body over his horse's head in the eagerness of flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Ichabod's horse seemed possessed by a demon. Plunging headlong down the road which leads through a sandy hollow shaded by trees, where it crosses the old wooden bridge before swelling into the green knoll that held the church. Just as Ichabod got halfway through the hollow, the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping around the horse's neck, when the saddle fell to the earth, trampled underfoot by his pursuer. Ichabod could hardly maintain his seat, slipping violently from one side to another, jolted painfully on the high ridge of the horse's backbone. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The shimmering reflection of the moon on the brook told him that he was not mistaken. If I can reach that bridge, Ichabod thought, I am safe. But the black steed was panting and blowing close behind him, tickling his neck with hot breath. With another kick, the horse sprang upon the bridge, thundering over the resounding planks to the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to the story, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Yet the massive horseman still approached, rising in his stirrups, and hurled his head at Ichabod. With a tremendous crash, Ichabod tumbled headlong into the dust as his horse galloped away, and the headless horseman passed by him like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast nor dinner. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle, trampled in the dirt, the tracks of horses' hooves deeply dented in the road, evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, where the water ran deep and black, they found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but Ichabod's body would not be discovered. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. They considered the tales of ghosts and apparitions, and shook their heads, concluding that Ichabod had been carried off by the headless horseman. Some believed Ichabod, mortified by Katrina's sudden dismissal, left for quarters in a distant part of the country. Shortly after his disappearance, Brom Bones met a blooming Katrina at the altar, and they married. At the festival that followed, Brom was observed to look exceedingly knowing when the story of Ichabod was mentioned, and he burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, and some believed he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. As Ichabod had no family, nobody troubled their head any more about him, and the school was shuttered, removed to the other end of the hollow, where another schoolmaster reigned in his absence. The deserted building fell into decay and was nearly forgotten when on one drowsy summer's day a pair of boys heard the low murmur of a man's voice from outside, like the hum of a beehive, and as they approached the broken glass windows, they swore they beheld a tall and lanky ghost, lowly singing the tune of a melancholy psalm among the tranquil solitude of Sleepy Hollow.